Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the untold story of how food became a weapon of control and how that same battle is still being fought today. Now, let me ask you something. When you think of power, what comes to mind? Armies? Banks? Laws? What if I told you the real power is food? That's right. Control the land, and you control the people. This isn't just poetic, it's historical fact. From ancient empires to modern governments, access to food has always been one of the most effective tools for maintaining power or suppressing resistance. Let's start in the present. Right now, across the Netherlands, farmers are protesting, not with weapons, but with tractors and signs. Why? Because of tightening regulations tied to climate policy and ESG investment standards. Yes, that acronym you see all over corporate mission statements. Environmental, social, and governance. Sounds harmless enough, right? But on the ground, these policies are being used to justify government buyouts of farmland and to push small farmers off their land, all under the banner of saving the planet. But here's the thing, this is not a new phenomenon. Look back, and you'll see a clear historical pattern. When governments or institutions step in to reshape agriculture, especially in centralized or top-down ways, the results are often catastrophic. Just ask the Irish during the potato famine, or Ukrainian peasants during Stalin's forced collectivization, or Chinese villagers under Mao's Great Leap Forward. Each time, food wasn't just a resource, it became a lever of control, and those who controlled its production held tremendous power over the population. This isn't some abstract theory, it's a thesis of power that plays out again and again across history. If you control the food supply, you control who eats and who doesn't. That means you control whether people can live independently or whether they must submit to the system to survive. So today, we'll trace that power dynamic through some of the most devastating and telling examples in history. We'll uncover how modern systems echo old patterns, and why understanding this recurring cycle might just be the key to protecting freedom in the future. Because when you dig deep enough, history always has receipts. Let's begin our journey in Ireland. The years are 1845 to 1852, a period forever etched into memory as the Irish potato famine. But what if I told you the famine wasn't truly caused by nature? Sure, a blight destroyed the potato crop, the staple food for millions of Irish people. But the real tragedy? It was manufactured by policy. Let's break this down. During the famine, Ireland was part of the British Empire, and the British elite saw Ireland not as a nation of people to protect, but as a colony to extract from. While Irish families starved in the countryside, ships full of grain, livestock, butter, and oats were being exported, not stolen, mind you, but exported under law. Legal, sanctioned, normal. The ideology behind it, laissez-faire economics, the belief that the government should never intervene in markets, even in a crisis. As millions cried out for food, officials argued that interfering would disrupt trade. But this wasn't just economic dogma, it was systemic neglect. Landlords, many of whom never even set foot in Ireland, continued to collect rents or evict tenants. The British Parliament passed poor laws that required Irish people to give up their land, their only means of survival, just to qualify for limited assistance. So, not only were they starving, but they were being stripped of any hope of recovering on their own. And the consequences? Catastrophic. Over 1 million people died, not just from hunger, but from disease, cold, and despair. And another million fled the country in search of survival. That means in just a few years, about 1/4 of Ireland's entire population was gone. This wasn't just a famine, it was a demographic collapse, one that scarred Irish identity, reshaped its economy, and fueled a lasting distrust of empire. Now here's the haunting part. Food was available, but policies, power structures, and ideology got in the way of people accessing it. And that's the theme we'll see again and again. When food policy is shaped far from the soil, and survival depends on the permission of distant powers, disaster isn't an accident. It's baked into the system. Now we shift east, to the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. The timeline, 1928 to 1940. And what we're about to explore is one of the deadliest examples of what happens when ideology overrides incentives, and central planning replaces local knowledge. This was the era of collectivization, a grand Soviet experiment to transform agriculture into a state-controlled machine. The logic? Private farms were inefficient. The future, Stalin believed, lay in collective farms run by quotas, not by farmers. So, the state began seizing land from individual farmers, many of whom had worked their soil for generations. These farmers were labeled kulaks, a term that quickly became synonymous with class enemy. Many were arrested, some were exiled, others were executed. Just like that, centuries of farming wisdom erased. The peasants who remained were herded into collective farms. But there was a problem. With no ownership, no reward for surplus, and no say in decision-making, motivation collapsed. Who would work harder for a system that took everything and gave nothing? And And then came the Holodomor. Between 1932 and 1933, Ukraine, one of the most fertile regions in the world, was ravaged by famine. Not because there wasn't enough food, but because the Soviet state demanded grain requisitions far beyond what was sustainable. Soldiers came door to door, confiscating grain, even seed grain, leaving entire villages with nothing. People ate grass, bark, pets. Some even turned to cannibalism. Between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians died. Let that sink in. A famine, not caused by drought or blight, but by political policy and forced requisition. And it didn't stop there. In the long run, collectivization crippled Soviet agriculture. Productivity plummeted. Soil was mismanaged. Incentives vanished. Rural communities were left demoralized, dependent, and deeply distrustful. For decades, the Soviet Union struggled to feed itself, not because it lacked land, but because it destroyed the very system that had once worked. This is what happens when control is prioritized over competence, and when abstract ideology is allowed to override human reality. Now let's turn to China. The year is 1958, and Chairman Mao Zedong has just launched an ambitious plan to catapult China into modernity, something he called the Great Leap Forward. But instead of leaping forward, China fell into one of the deadliest famines in human history. At the heart of Mao's campaign was a radical restructuring of rural life. Family farms were abolished. Communes were formed, massive collectives where thousands of people now lived, worked, and ate together. Sounds unified, right? But in practice, this erased the very thing that made traditional agriculture work: local knowledge, community autonomy, and the connection between effort and reward. Farmers were no longer growing food for their families or even their villages, they were growing it for quotas set by distant party officials. And here's where it gets tragic. To meet these quotas, or at least to appear as though they were meeting them, local leaders began inflating their harvest numbers. Picture this: the grain production is failing, but reports say it's booming, so the state raises the quota even higher. Grain is seized, sometimes all of it, and the government has no idea that people are already starving. Or worse, they know, but the numbers tell a more politically convenient story. And the result? Over 30 million people died. Let me say that again, 30 million. From starvation, from disease, from desperation. Villages vanished, families were erased, all under a system that prized illusion over truth. And perhaps most telling of all, it wasn't until Deng Xiaoping's reforms decades later, when elements of market logic were cautiously reintroduced, that agricultural productivity began to recover. Mao's Great Leap Forward shows what happens when centralized power not only controls the land, but silences feedback, ignores reality, and punishes those who question the plan. It wasn't just a famine, it was a silencing, a systemic erasure of truth that cost millions their lives. Let's fast forward to the 21st century. Sri Lanka, a tropical nation known for its lush landscapes, rich culture, and, more recently, an economic collapse tied directly to food policy. In 2021, the government of Sri Lanka made a bold, and some would say reckless, decision: an immediate nationwide ban on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Overnight, the country was forced to switch to 100% organic farming. Now, organic agriculture sounds great in theory, doesn't it? Healthier food, better for the environment, a return to naturals farming. But here's the thing: when you scale that shift across an entire nation with zero transition period, no infrastructure in place, and no contingency plan, you don't get a green utopia, you get collapse. Farmers were left scrambling. Yields plummeted. Sri Lanka had been self-sufficient in rice for years. Suddenly, it had to import hundreds of thousands of tons just to feed its population. Tea, the country's top export, also took a massive hit, wiping out critical foreign currency reserves. That set off a chain reaction. Food prices soared. Fuel became scarce. The economy spiraled. By mid-2022, the consequences were unavoidable. Protests erupted. People stormed the presidential palace, and the government, the very one that had promised prosperity through purity, fell. What's important here is not just that the policy failed, it's that it was imposed from the top down, driven more by international pressure and ideological image than by practical readiness. Farmers weren't given a choice, they weren't given time, they were given orders. And it's worth noting, many of the same elite institutions that championed Sri Lanka's green transition quietly walked away after it collapsed. This wasn't ancient history, it happened in our timeline, in our headlines, and it proves that even in today's world, technocratic overreach can still lead to empty shelves, social unrest, and governments crumbling under the weight of their own idealism. Now we head to the Netherlands, a small country with a big role in global food production. Despite its size, the Netherlands is the second largest agricultural exporter in the world. That's right, second only to the United States. So why are Dutch farmers driving tractors into cities, blocking highways, and lighting fires in protest? Because once again, policy is trying to override the plow. In recent years, Dutch farmers have come under immense pressure to reduce nitrogen emissions, particularly from livestock. Government mandates, rooted in environmental goals, now demand that thousands of farms either scale back operations or shut down entirely. And to enforce this, the government has proposed forcibly buying out farmland. In some cases, expropriation. That's a fancy word for we're taking your land whether you like it or not. But it doesn't stop there. These policies are deeply tied to ESG, environmental, social, and governance, the modern framework that dictates how businesses and investments align with global goals. While ESG is promoted as socially responsible investing, in practice, it often means compliance with centralized rules written far from the farm. So, who benefits from all this? It's not the small farmer who's raised cattle for generations. It's not the rural community built around the land. It's the institutional investors, multinationals, and agritech conglomerates buying up that land, sometimes with backing from global asset firms. And here's the twist: these pressures aren't organic. They come from a blend of EU regulations, climate targets, and investor incentives that effectively kneecap traditional farming in favor of large-scale, high-efficiency, high-control alternatives. This isn't a local story. It's a microcosm of a global shift where land ownership, food policy, and regulatory compliance are converging, and in the process, a centuries-old class of independent farmers is being pushed out. In short, the Netherlands isn't just a farming nation. It's a battleground, a test case, and the world is watching to see what happens when the most efficient food producers on Earth are told they're no longer sustainable unless they hand over the reins. Now let's bring this conversation home to the United States. When we think of American farming, we often imagine wide-open fields, family-run homesteads, tractors at sunrise, and hard-earned independence. But look a little closer, and you'll see a system that's been slowly but surely reshaped, not by farmers, but by policy, corporations, and capital. Let's start with subsidies. On paper, they're supposed to help farmers survive unpredictable seasons or droughts, floods, fluctuating markets. And in theory, they do. But in practice, they've created a system of dependency and distortion. The majority of subsidies don't go to small, diverse farms growing fruits and vegetables. They go to large-scale operations producing corn, soybeans, and wheat, often used for animal feed, processed food, or fuel. This shifts both the landscape and the incentives. Instead of growing what the community needs, many farmers are pressured, or paid, to grow what the system demands. Now enter the monopolies. Over time, a handful of agribusiness giants have consolidated control over seeds, fertilizer, meat packing, and distribution. Want to grow soy? You're probably buying patented seeds from one of just a few mega firms. Want to sell your cattle? You'll likely go through one of 4 dominant meat processors. These companies don't just influence prices, they set the terms. And farmers, despite doing the labor, often find themselves squeezed at every step. Then there's the land grab. Over the past 2 decades, institutional investors, think hedge funds, pension plans, and even billionaires, have quietly bought up millions of acres of American farmland. Why? Because land is stable. It appreciates. And in a world of economic uncertainty, controlling food production isn't just safe, it's strategic. But here's the kicker: as the average age of the American farmer rises, fewer young people are taking over. With barriers to entry high and profit margins thin, more farmland is being leased or sold to outsiders. What was once a deeply personal, generational craft is increasingly becoming a managed asset on a spreadsheet. So when we talk about the vanishing farmer, it's not just nostalgia, it's a real shift. From independence to interdependence, from production to compliance, from farming as a way of life to farming as an extension of policy and profit. The United States may still feed the world, but fewer and fewer people control how, when, and what gets grown. By now, you might be noticing a pattern. Across centuries, across continents, and under widely different political systems, when central authorities take direct control over agriculture, the consequences tend to follow a familiar script. Let's break it down. First, the destruction of local knowledge. When policies come from the top, whether from a royal court, a central committee, or a modern ministry, they often ignore the lived experience of those who actually work the land. Farmers know their soil, their seasons, their communities, but when decisions are made by people who have never planted a seed, the wisdom of generations can be erased overnight. Second, the war on incentives. In every case we've looked at, farmers are asked to keep producing, but without the ownership, autonomy, or reward that once motivated them. Whether it's collectivized grain in Stalin's USSR or forced organic farming in Sri Lanka, the same result follows: people work less, grow less, or stop altogether, not out of laziness, but because the system punishes initiative and rewards obedience. Third, the rise of black markets. When official systems fail to meet demand, people don't just starve quietly. They adapt. They go underground. From smuggled potatoes in famine-era Ireland to illicit grain trading in Soviet Ukraine, informal markets pop up whenever formal systems collapse. They're not a flaw, they're a survival mechanism. And finally, the creation of dependency. Perhaps the most subtle and dangerous effect of centralized AG policy is that it turns once self-reliant communities into dependents. When you can no longer grow your own food without permission, when you must rely on state rations, subsidies, or international aid, you're no longer free. You're managed. This is not about left or right, east or west, rich or poor. The mechanism is the same. Concentrate control over land and food, and you concentrate control over people. That's why these patterns matter, because they're not just relics of history, they're warnings, blueprints, and they raise a crucial question. What happens when the system that feeds you no longer serves you? So, what does all of this mean for us, right now? History has spoken, loudly and repeatedly, and yet, the modern world seems to be sleepwalking into the same traps, just dressed up in new language. We see ESG mandates, net zero targets, sustainable development goals, and on the surface, they sound noble, clean, global. But if we zoom out, do they look all that different from the top-down schemes of the past? Here's the uncomfortable truth. If we continue centralizing control over food, whether through global finance, bureaucratic mandates, or abstract carbon quotas, we risk repeating history, not learning from it. When farmers are no longer decision-makers, but policy recipients, when land is no longer for living on, but for extracting profit, when food systems are no longer judged by how well they feed people, but by how well they meet targets, that's not resilience, that's fragility, and the ripple effects go far beyond agriculture. They touch freedom, sovereignty, even culture itself, because when people lose the right to feed themselves, they eventually lose the right to govern themselves. So this isn't just about the past, it's about trajectory. We have to ask, who is steering the system? And are they accountable to the people who eat, or to the people who invest? It's not about nostalgia for some idealized past. It's about responsibility and memory. Because the further we drift from the lessons of history, the more likely we are to wake up in a system we don't recognize, but one that history already warned us about. So where does all of this leave us? If there's one lesson we can take from history, it's this: freedom starts at the ground level. Literally, the ability to work your land, to grow your food, to support your community without having to beg for permission. That's not just agriculture, that's independence. Because once food is fully centralized, everything else follows. Dependence breeds compliance, and compliance, well, that makes control easy. But history doesn't just give us warnings, it gives us hope. Communities that understand these patterns can protect themselves from repeating them by supporting local farmers, by questioning policies that concentrate too much power in too few hands, by remembering that land and food are not just commodities, they are the foundations of life. And that's why these stories matter. They're not just tales of past suffering. They're reminders of what's at stake when we allow the people who feed us to be replaced by systems that feed on us. Thank you for watching this deep dive on truth behind history. If you found this video eye-opening, please hit like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more content that challenges the narratives we've been told. And if you really want to dig deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase, linked below in the description. It's packed with the stories and connections mainstream history books leave out. Finally, if you enjoy thoughtful, engaging history, the kind that pulls no punches and connects past to present, explore the other videos on this channel. Because as we've seen today, history doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it definitely rhymes.